All right. So first of all, I want to thank everybody again for joining us. I see a really good turnout here, and I'm excited to talk about this stuff. As Karen said, we're talking primarily about technology here, and we're moving forward into acquisition strategies. But we'll be able to speak to sort of how some of these interactions between between these different groups of people within the IAE environment will be able to interact and work with each other, both at a technical level and sort of by procedure. So we'll talk through that as we go forward. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the platform drivers that we had here. I mean, the first thing I should say is, this week we're finishing up our first release, our first internal release of the Common Services Platform. We've built out a number of capabilities, and I can't be more proud of what we've done here. Min Fan, who's my program manager on this stuff, and Booz Allen have done a great job in executing and really working with us to be able to move forward. And so we're going to talk a bit about sort of how we've sort of arrived here, how we make decisions around what the platform looks like as we go forward, and how the platform is actually shaping up as we go forward. So let's talk about some of these drivers. First, actually cloudy, right? So what does that really mean? What it means is just putting something on an infrastructure as a service capability doesn't make it a cloud capability, right? If you can't scale up and down, if you can't work with your demand over time, then you're not really taking advantage of why you would even go to the cloud, right? So we have an environment which is vastly different on September 15th than it is on January 15th. It's vastly different on Wednesday, at midnight EST versus, Tuesday afternoon, at 2 p.m., right? So we want to really be able to get to the point where we're actually leveraging all of those changes in demand for the best efficiency for our customers and for the government in how it uses these platforms, right? So that really does necessitate a fair amount of thinking around the architecture to make that work out, not just at a platform level, but also at an application level. We're going to, really aim here at continuous integration and eventually, hopefully, continuous delivery in service of quality delivery, right? That means automated everything, right? That it means push button deploys. It means that your tests and your functional tests and your unit tests are all part of the build process, right? They're not something that you run independently, that you execute manually. You really are automating all of that capability. Secure by design, right? Part of the reason why we have this PaaS platform that we're building out is really to ensure that there's really heavy guardrails from a number of perspectives, including security, that make sure that we have built in all of our security controls that we need to be able to consider from the ground up, right? Security is not a layer on top here. Security is built in from the ground, from the very beginning. We want to be providing complete capabilities for developers. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward, but we want developer creativity, but we also need to understand that manageability of the platform itself does constrain sort of how creative we're going to be. And in order to then serve you as developers, we need to be able to provide you a full tool set to do your work and also listen to your feedback as we go forward. Data is king. So Karen pointed this out a few minutes ago. Our job here is stewarding this award data for the entire federal government, which means everything that we do is driven primarily by data. And I think one of the other emphases that we would want to make there, right? It's primarily by data and less so by workflow, right? We're not generally involved in complicated workflows about how we actually buy things. We're not your CWS. We're not your case management system. We are your data stewards. And so that's really sort of the design choices that we've made around the architecture have driven us in certain directions here. We've been lighter on, say, business process management and heavier on business rule management because that's where we need to live. And of course, evolutionary change, right? We want it, 2 years from now, our world is going to be very different, right? We are making choices now that we know will need to be able to be changed as we go forward. There needs to be a certain amount of independence, say, between our IaaS and our PaaS. So we need to be able to enable that in the early go so that we can make some changes as we go forward. We also know that new tools will come into existence that could greatly impact efficiency of delivery and quality of delivery. we want to be able to incorporate that change over time, right? So that evolutionary change is very important to the platform as a whole. What that really means is as we look at all the tools and environments and layers that we were building out that we're going to present here today, that's not our final resting place by any means, right? We really are not going to stay still in that process, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the conceptual architecture. And one of the things I would say here, right, you're going to see a lot of small print. I'm going to be, highlighting specific items throughout these diagrams, and of course the presentation, when it's posted, will be, viewable, in great detail by you, as well as other documentation that we'll be posting in the next few weeks. So, let me hit some highlights here, right? So conceptually, you see a sort of very layered architecture here, from the IaaS end of the world at the bottom, through the data layer, through sort of the orchestration layers that we'll work through, build and deploy and external management of developers, out to the service architecture, which is kind of our, our COP, basically, that this is your entry point through our service architecture, and then through the presentation layer. These components and these services, some of them are shared across every application. For example, we have a data lake. That data lake is shared across every application. There's only going to be one of those. We have an identity and access management solution, another case where we have a single solution that's going to be used by everybody. But then, some of them are going to be single-tenant solutions. Each application will have its own database that's going to be used for transactional activities. Those are sort of, individual decisions are going to be made within individual application architectures, because certain applications won't need certain capabilities. So we don't want to enforce that down the application architectures when we don't need it. We don't want to make our application architectures bigger than they need to be. We have this architecture as a whole are going to guide the tools that all the core developers can use. And in the end, we have this need and push towards continuous integration and continuous delivery that we really want to move towards. There's this whole layer of orchestration that's really all about that, right? Being able to measure what we've done, being able to test what we've done, test it not just from the perspective of functional tests, but also performance tests, also, security tests. All of that is built into this platform architecture. And, for the purposes of folks who are interested in becoming a core, right, those are things that you don't have to bring to the table, right? They're part of the platform. So again, this is something where, oh my gosh, lots of stuff on the screen. So let's highlight a couple key points, right? So this is a little bit more, going through some of those layers, right? We have an infrastructure layer, which is an IaaS cloud provider. Currently, we're using Amazon as our IaaS cloud provider. However, we do know that as we go forward, we want to be able to be somewhat independent, vendor independent of that capability, right? And that's not for multiple reasons, right? There's cost efficiencies that can be gained by doing that. There's also availability efficiencies that we can gain by separating concerns across multiple IaaS providers and making that as transparent as possible. We have data repositories. We have primarily all of this is open source capability, right? So our data providers, our data solutions are open source data solutions fundamentally, and we're moving in that direction. So we have our data lake capabilities, which are built off of a stack of open source tools, as well as our individual data stores, which are things like MongoDB and Postgres, which are going to be our core drivers for that. We have a middleware set, which is really sort of that layer between data and our application development capability, right? So that's where we really provide you, as an application developer, access to, say, our identity and access management solution. So if you have a user base, we would provide you that IAM solution, which primarily is about giving you authentication capabilities. And the application providers would, within their business logic, identify roles and authorization capabilities that would layer on top of that. The application hosting is all containerized, as we'll talk about a little bit more, and that application hosting leads to an API capability that each application developer would create, as well as a presentation layer on top of that API. So we're going to delve into each of these layers in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about some of the tools and capabilities that we're really providing you. So With the CSP hosting architecture, let's talk a little bit about that, right? So we've in the past spoken about our containerization strategy. Our strategy is basically using Chef for configuration management and Docker for containerization. The entire PaaS capability is going to be deployed as Docker containers within each different environment, right? That we have. We have our production, our non-production, our testing, and our development environment, and all of that is going to be driven in the end by these Docker containers that we're going to stand up. This actually enables something we've talked about before as well, which was our infrastructure as code capabilities, right? Everything that we're doing here is going to be driven through configuration of Chef and Docker capabilities. That's very important for our transparency, our vendor independence. It's also very important for our openness, right? We want to be able to publish all of those things to the wide world so people can see how our configurations are designed. We have at this point Java runtimes, Ruby runtimes, as well as we're looking at PHP and Node.js as also available capabilities as we go forward within this architecture. So that through that containerization, that really kind of leads up to the basically all the way up to our API management layer, which is enabled through our ESB capabilities and our other tools that we have in place that we'll talk about in a moment. You can see here though that the hosting layer is sort of the layer, right? It is everything else lands on top of that hosting layer for deployment. Parallel to this hosting layer and driven by it is our core repository, our code repository really. This code, all of our code is going to be within a code repository, which eventually leads to GitHub, right? So that's where we're going to end up publishing all of this stuff. We have a number of controls in place between GitHub and just sort of general open work, right? So we do have one or two layers of security concern that we do need to put into place before the code gets up to GitHub. But that GitHub code is actually what kind of loops back and deploys our hosting environment, right? In the end, we will have all of this code, all of our containers, all of our configuration up in GitHub that we can deploy out there. So what we will have here is, as a core developer, you'll have these standardized Docker containers that you'll be able to use to build your applications within. And that's also how you would deliver back to us as a developer your working code, right? So you would have your code up in our code repository, which is then linked to a set of Docker containers that really build out your application, which would then be deployed onto the Common Services Platform hosting. One thing I do want to remind everybody is that if you have a question, if you have a Q&A at any point, just type into the Q&A box, and we'll be tracking those questions for answering as we go forward, either throughout the discussion or at the end. So there's a layer of common components that really enable the workflow that we were talking about, as well as enabling some user-facing capabilities, right? In order to build your code, you want to be able to do your testing. In order to get those Docker containers, you need to be able to find them and be able to pull them down from a centralized site so that you know what's available to you, right? This is, as a core developer, you're really going to be given a specific set of containers that you'd be able to use to build your application out. And that's something that's very key to our strategy, because there's only so many of these containers we can really manage, secure, and work with to make a sort of a feasible architecture. And of course, going back to our evolutionary plan here, it doesn't mean that we won't add new containers as we go forward, but it does mean that we do want to control those, right? So how are you going to get at those containers? That's where we get to this common components view of the world, right? So there's a few capabilities here across the board that we really want to speak to, and we'll see some of this in detail as well going forward, right? We're going to be developing a dashboard, a marketplace. And that marketplace is really where, and you'll see some screenshots and notional screenshots going forward. That marketplace is where you as a developer would go to select the components that you need to build your application throughout all tiers of development, right? So your development tier, your testing tier, your non-production tiers. That's how you're going to go off and build your application. You'll leverage all these common tools, right? We have, as we said, we're going to have an internal Git capability and a GitHub capability. That's where you're going to go for managing your code, right? And that's where you go in, check in your code, use your code, and use your and be able to develop against those containers that you selected, right? We have a continuous integration capability driven by Jenkins amongst other tools. That would be required use, right? The way we see us going forward is that as each sprint goes forward in core development, our requirement will be in that sprint, you have to develop your tests and automate those tests for anything you build within a sprint, right? You don't get out of a sprint without doing that. It's not considered done. And so that's going to be a very key part of our strategy. And of course, we have metrics and management around all of this that also is available to you, right? As an application, as you're doing O&M on the application that you've built, right? You'd want to see the logs for that application to see if there's any issues. So we have tools around that are provided to you, so you can see, okay, usage, and you can delve into logs if you need to delve into logs to identify where bugs are. We also have, just to point out one or two more other things, we have Jira with a number of plugins that we're using for agile software development. We would expect you to be part of that Jira community, right? We have set up that community so that we have a roll-up from basically the portfolio level downward. Your progress as a core developer feeds into the portfolio's progress as IAE in moving forward, and that's the way we would actually end up tracking that. So we're setting up all of those capabilities to make sure that that works. And of course, we have that API management capability as well. API first, right? So our expectation is that everything that you build is developed first as an API and then built as a presentation. Most of the time in parallel, you build the components of the API that you need for the presentation layer that you're working on within a given sprint. More likely than not always, but that's likely what we're going to do. We're going to provide you the tools to manage the public-facing view of that API as well as the internal-facing view of any APIs that we'd use only within IAE. So that's really where that's where a big chunk of this work is going. I certainly didn't cover every component, but I hit some of the key highlights there. So speaking of those APIs, right? So now that leads nicely to this discussion. We do have an ESB. That's the Talent ESB. That's the Talent ESB, and we have an API gateway, which is actually built off of API Umbrella, which is what drives api.data.gov. Now, one of the things that we're looking at, right, is as we go forward with our application development, how much do we really want to rely on an ESB versus essentially deployment of microservices? That's not necessarily a decision that we've made yet, but that's something to really think about, right? These applications that we're going to be building may be, they should be able to be designed around small services that are focused towards specific, functional needs, right? And if we can do that appropriately, we really should be able to start, developing out essentially a microservice strategy for IAE that's driven by this tool set. We certainly, though, do need an ESB for some of our legacy capabilities and replication of legacy capabilities as we go forward. We do have a management portal that we are building out. That portal right now is heavily driven by OpenIAE, which is a GitHub site for providing information to our API users as well as other users of SAM IAE data. So, we're basically looking at that portal as saying, okay, we're going to merge our capabilities around using API Umbrella for managing our key capability, our transactional key management capabilities and throttling that we need to work with, and then keep going forward with the strategy that we've built on GitHub at this point. So we talked a bit earlier about our data management capability, and that being, and data being king. And I mentioned briefly that we have this idea of a single data lake, right? Which is, this data lake is what allows us to ingest the wide variety of data that IAE manages in both structured and unstructured forms, and make it available for query, for search, for reporting, and all of those other capabilities. It doesn't preclude us from using structured data sets or NoSQL databases as landing points for data within our environment. It certainly does not mean that we're pushing entirely towards this towards a data lake only solution, but it does mean that we're able to use tools like Hadoop, Scoop, Pig, and all of these other fun, hilariously named tools that we've got here within our data lake suite to actually provide broader and more rapid access to the data sets that we've had. And we've had some great success already within Release 1 of showing off how these tools can be used, given legacy data sets already. The expectation would be that an application developer would build out a transactional database within their environment. That transactional database, it would be tuned to the day-to-day activities and the work-in-progress activities that an application needs to manage, right? So if we take, as an example, the posting of an opportunity, right? Within the space of an opportunity, there's going to be times where there's going to be people are going to be reviewing it. Things are going to be in draft states. Those are not things that need to be part of the data lake, right? They're not really things that we would want to make searchable or widely available, right? That's not really the goal there. But within the transactional, but we do need to manage those and structure those and support the performance needed by that application to be able to execute. So the expectation there would be, okay, you're going to stand up whatever's appropriate, with a MongoDB database, a Postgres database, whatever seems to make the most sense within that environment. Build that application and then push basically on appropriate events into the data lake to make that data more widely available. There are still architectural decisions that need to be made about specifically where and how APIs would access that data, right? Do they go to the transactional data stores, or do the do we send our read-only database APIs directly to our data lake? That seems to be the solution that we're leaning towards, but we still have a few decisions to be made along those lines. So that's really where we're moving forward. What this data lake really is going to enable us as a government, not just IAE, to do is to merge this data together in ways that we couldn't merge it before. There's this idea that's always been kicked around. Well, why, do I, as a vendor, have to go to 3 different places to see all the information that the government has about me within the award context, right? Well, this is that solution to that problem, right? This puts that data together, links it together, and makes it available to you either via an API or an application that we can build on top of it. So let's take a pause here. There's a few questions that have popped up, and so I'd like to answer those as appropriate. So one of the questions was asked is, so how far along did we get in Release 1? So I would say that we actually have about, 80% of the stack? Yeah, about 80% of the stack done, developed. It's not all deployed as infrastructure as code just yet, but it's working, right? We have a data lake running, working. We have an IAM solution running and working. We have the whole IaaS environment and the security layer around it, and the API solution out and working as well. And the marketplace, yeah, and the first version of the marketplace up and running as well. So those are all available to us internally, and we're working in Release 2 to essentially, our objective in Release 2, which ends at the end of June, is to have an environment that, really this is kind of how I've stated it to the team, the developer needs to be able to come in and build an application on top of this environment at the end of June, right? Not everything is going to be working 100%. The marketplace may not be the best user experience right away, but you should be able to build and deploy an application starting in June, right? And so that is really where we want to be able to be. That also means we're getting, through an initial operating capability with an ATO. All of that is happening in that time frame between June and, at the end of June, we'll have the capability. Between June and July, we're really aiming at getting that ATO to be able to deploy those applications out into the world. And as we talk a little bit about being that CSP developer, we'll talk about how that interaction really will play out a little bit more. Okay. So let's talk about how you as a core developer will play within this environment. So, as we mentioned a little earlier, right? The common services environment really are designed to be guardrails, right? And what I mean by that is this, right? We want to give you as many lanes of the highway to work with as possible, but there's only so much we can do, right? And so we really do want to say, hey, here's your path. This is how an application that you build is going to get deployed. Here's the set of tools that you can use to build those applications out. The reason we want to do that, let's take the latter example, actually both of those examples as key items, right? We have governance capabilities that we have to manage, right? So that aren't really the responsibility of a core developer to manage, right? We as IE, as a program, have to manage those capabilities. So your deployment of an application really does, that final push of the button really does have to come from us as a government, and more importantly, from those governance capabilities, governance organizations that we spoke about earlier, that Karen spoke about earlier, that CCB, the ACE, the PCE, right? So, we can build code, and if the CCB is not entirely ready for it, right, for all sorts of valid reasons, right, we may say, okay, we need to hold on to that for a little bit. That shouldn't prevent you from moving forward and doing, additional work. Additionally, we have all of these security concerns that we want to alleviate, essentially. We want to take as many of those security concerns and security controls and resolve them in the PaaS environment before they even get to you as a core developer, right? And what that means is, hey, if we're going to build out Node.js, we may not say, we may say you don't get to go to Node.js version, 0.2.3 because we haven't done the security work on that, right? As much as you want to use these 4 features from it, and that would save time, we've got to go through the security features for that. As soon as it's available, hey, you're going to know, and you can go transition as you need. But those are things that we really need to be able to control and manage, right? This allows it actually lets us get through ATOs much more quickly, which is very important for sort of our development, our delivery environment. So, but here's the thing: we don't want to turn to you and say, hey, don't ever tell us something that's interesting that's out there, right? That's not what we really want. We want you as a core developer to come to us and say, hey, here are recommendations that we would have about the user experience of the marketplace, about tools that we think you should incorporate into the environment, about languages that we should add. Because if you had CoffeeScript and Scala, we could do XYZ, right? Those are things that we want to really consider, and we want to incorporate as it makes sense. So there's going to be an architectural change process that we're going to put into place that we're working through here that would basically say, hey, how do we consider the addition of that capability? When could we add that capability? How does that make sense in terms of our roadmap, our security constraints, or any other governance constraints that we might have? So that's something that actually we're going to really build into our tasks that we're going to be asking of you, right? Like we're going to be telling you, hey, bring innovation to the environment. We have both a bit of a luxury and a curse of being able to say, hey, this is our green field, right? The luxury is we get to make those decisions, right? We get to make those decisions, and we can make those decisions in such a way that speeds us to delivery, right? But it does mean that we have, and we don't have to as much worry about a lot of the legacy environments, right? We're not necessarily held back, immediately by the decisions that were made, say, 5 or 7 years ago, which, were perfectly reasonable decisions back then, but maybe preventing us somewhat from moving forward right now. But we do want to see the curse part of it, right? Is that we don't get to do everything we would want to do, right? Certainly, myself, or, and other folks, right? Their favorite language didn't get to be part of the environment, right? But we had to make those hard choices to make sure that we could really make a usable environment. But that gives you as a core less concern about, less security concern and less, fewer things to manage in some ways, right? So we're really hoping to make the vast majority of those controls, again, as I mentioned, part of the PaaS environment, but there certainly are application level controls that every single application will need to go through before it can be deployed to the world. But the idea would be, we're working hand in hand with our security organization here in the GSA to basically say, hey, how are we going to do this? How are we going to put you, or ISSO, ISSM, in the room as these applications are being developed, so that there's no surprises, right? There's no oh my gosh, now you have to spend an extra month before you do a deploy because you forgot to do XYZ scan and we found 3 things that were broke, right? That's something we're really trying to avoid. Okay. So, starting in June, we reach IOC, as I mentioned earlier, right? We're first starting out with we're supporting Java as our first development language, and we're going to grow out to a few of these other languages that I mentioned earlier. Ruby, PHP, and Node.js are the primary candidates to add on to as we go forward from June. The developer marketplace is going to have a selection of capabilities that are really going to drive towards, okay, I need to go and get my Java, web application container. I need a medium-sized database. I need, a couple other capabilities to put together, basically, in terms, as Lego blocks, in your application development, and put those things together and be able to set yourself up for deployment of an application. And I use that phrase very carefully, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. We have this initial set of capabilities around the hosting, the IAM, the data capabilities, the API management capabilities, and all the development tools that we're going to be providing you. They may not be the prettiest things to go out with, but one of the key things that we'd be asking of you, especially in what we're calling the Release 3 timeframe, which is June to October, right, is for you as, whoever's working on building out these applications, is for you to come back to us and really be part of the processes, the feedback loop towards how do we make that marketplace more usable for developers going forward, right? That's going to be a very key thing that we're going to be asked of you. We're really going to be moving at this infrastructure as a code item, right? You as a developer will not be able to deliver anything except applications that can be built entirely infrastructure as code, right? So part of the marketplace work, that we be working towards, right, is making that as easy as possible for you. It also means that you're a little bit constrained, right? You're going to have Docker containers that you're going to be using that you can't SSH into, right? So most of your developers are going to be used to the idea of, I can get to a command line, I can mess around with it. Well, I can get to the command line and mess around with it is a surefire way to not be able to deploy that thing the way that you expected to build it, right? You make a configuration change that you forget about. This basically forces you to out of that methodology, and because we've done infrastructure as code, we can actually build every single check-in, or at least maybe every single hour or whatever. We can build everything out of the that's in GitHub essentially, or within our internal Git environment from the ground up to ensure that it works, right? And run all those tests to ensure that it works. So that's the way we're really gonna make that work for you. And we're going to manage all this within our code repository that's integrated with all those tools, with Jenkins, with Selenium, with all these other tools that we've got in place as we go forward. So what's your workflow, right? And what's your interaction with the Common Services Platform? How is that really going to work, right? So you as a developer would go in to view the app in the marketplace. You download your images for local testing if you want to do that, if you feel that that's a necessary part of the workflow, that's fine. You can bring that stuff into your environment. You provision an instance of the development environment. Obviously, this is not something that would be the full production size. It's just enough for you to use as a developer and build out your applications. And build out the application capabilities, right? So the application node capabilities isn't just the code itself, right? It's the configuration that actually deploys that code within that Docker container. It's the tests that go along with that code. It's all of those hooks, right, that make a deployable container that we can actually push out into the real world. That's all driven through Git, and then you basically deploy that node that you've built into your container, right? So you build your Node.js application, you set up your scripts, you've done all that stuff, and now you've modified the Docker, or rather you've added to the appropriate Docker scripts and Chef scripts, and now you can deploy into the container. All of this. So here's the thing, right? You as a core developer aren't really necessarily going to be deploying something into production, right? We have a DevOps group. The DevOps IVNV contract that we're about to award here, right, that group is going to be the final sort of arbiter of how something can go into production, right? And what does that mean? It means that they would be coming back and saying, yes, the test coverage is appropriate based on the requirements, right? That's a key thing that, we would say, right? So they would be, sampling functional tests, unit tests, and saying, yeah, that actually is testing what it says it's testing, or no, it's not. That's just kind of returning true all the time. So that's not really running any tests. They would be giving us a heads up on those ideas. They would be ensuring that all the test reports actually have been, all the test reports indicate that all those tests have run and are actually successful, that the performance testing, all of those things have sort of succeeded. And then they would be the ones who'd be basically coming to us, the government, and saying, okay, when you're ready, everything looks good. And then Git flow, which is basically a workflow tool that sits on top of Git, would be used to push something into production. The expectation there, so is basically that's a push button deploy. Literally a push button deploy. It is a single command in Git should run the entire, build, test, regression test, deploy cycle to production. Right. That's the goal that we've got. Okay. I've got a few minutes left, so let me manage my time a little bit here. So here's actually the way the marketplace looks right now, and then this is your primary view into the world, but moving forward, it's how we want it to look in the future, right? Which is something a little bit more slick, a little bit clean, and you can see here how you could pick items off your infrastructure items, your platform items, and put them together to make them work. There's samples here of items that, this is just a notional view. This is not necessarily speaking to specific tools that we would be using going forward. So as I mentioned, right, we would be expecting you to come back with us to make the user experience of the marketplace better as we go forward. And the first version of that CSP will be made available to everybody in June, right? Our goal is at the end of the release, we will have at least a big chunk of our developer platform out into GitHub, as much as is openable at that time frame. All right? So next steps, right? As Karen mentioned earlier, right, and I know that a lot of people here on the phone are going to be eager about, right, we're going to be speaking in the upcoming near term about acquisition strategies, so I know that that's going to be a big next step for all of you all. But this is, this is what we want you to be aware of. This is what we want you to be able to compete toward. This is our paths, right? This is how we're going to be building our applications going forward. It's meant to be a collaborative environment. It's meant to be something where there's feedback allowed, but there are some constraints that are going to be put on you. All of this code that you're going to produce is going to be open source, available in GitHub. It's going to be deployed via these processes that we have controls around and containerized around those capabilities. Now, in the last few minutes, let's see here. I think I've largely answered most of these questions. So there was a question about how the core application developers will interact with the IVNV and DevOps team. So I spoke a little bit to that, right? That their IVNV of DevOps I've always talked to as sort of our tactical quality management teams in a lot of ways, right? But they really are enabling a DevOps capability, right? The idea there being like you as a developer and the operational deployment of that capability, it really has to be conjoined there within that space. We are putting platform developers, DevOps teams, and business teams and your core developers basically on these Scrum teams to make them work out, right? Doesn't mean that everybody's in the room at all times, but it does mean that they are partners in that collaboration of building out each individual, potentially shippable increment every 2 weeks, right? That's one of the key things that I would say that DevOps team is also going to be telling us, right? Is the result of every 2 weeks something that you could deploy to the world if you wanted to, right? It may not be fully complete, it may have some issues, right? But is it deployable? Would it work if I did that? We want your feedback, not just on the user experience, but also on new tools that we should add to the environment as we go forward. When you get into that environment, like we will absolutely listen to you if you say, right, I can get there faster if only I had this, right? But we do have to consider all those architectural constraints that we spoke about earlier. Openness is a key one, right? It's not likely that we would bring in a heavily proprietary tool within this environment if we can avoid it, right? So those are decisions that we're making. The flow of applications, I think that we'll speak more to that around the acquisition strategy. We do have a sense, in the past, we've put up a chart of migrations that has been modified a bit as we go forward. We do know that the early view of the world, right, is that we're going to be looking at some of our legacy applications and actually just fully modernizing them. And working on, say, migrating some of our existing environments into the IaaS part of the path. But I don't want necessarily, until we talk a little bit more about the acquisition strategies, I think we want to leave that aside for the moment. So in terms of day-to-day interactions with our core provider, our CSE providers for you as a core, we're certainly going to be setting SLAs on our platform provider to ensure that you get the service that you need. But we also, especially in releases 3 and 4, which is basically filling out the rest of this calendar year, the expectation is that there's going to be a bit of cross-pollination, putting people in the same room so that the user experience can get better, so that we understand things like, something that we thought is obvious in the marketplace really should have been addressed, and we should fix it. And then I think that's really where we really are right now. And so I think this has been a great experience to be able to speak to you all. I hope we actually are able to. We hope we've answered a number of your questions. I know we probably haven't answered all of them. We should be able to keep an eye out on Interact and our other channels of communication to see when these next industry days are coming up. And certainly ask more questions, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come in. Our intent in the next few weeks is to be able to publish more information and more detail about the architecture onto OpenIAE. So you will, my intent really is to publish the entire architectural document, which includes an immense amount of detail onto OpenIAE. So you'll be able to peruse that, independently of a fuzzy slide with a lot of text on it, right? So you'll be able to really see these things in great detail. So I appreciate the collaboration here, the communication, and if you have further questions, certainly we'll do our best to answer them offline. Thank you very much.